Welcome to one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Charleston. Before you begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're hearing this narration. The year was 1858, and beneath Charleston's pale blue sky stood Jeremiah Blackwood, a wealthy plantation owner recently widowed with 3 children and no one to manage his household. The Charleston Mercury's auction notice seemed a providential answer. That morning, as the final lot was presented, a young woman named Esther, an eerie silence fell over the crowd. Previously eager bidders lowered their paddles, averting their eyes. Noting her beauty and apparent health, Blackwood raised his paddle alone. For $20, she became his property. It wasn't until he discovered the collection of letters hidden in her previous owner's correspondence that he understood why no other man had dared to bid against him. The auction block stood in the shadow of St. Michael's Church, whose bells tolled 11 times as Esther was led forward, her eyes cast downward, her slender frame draped in a simple cotton dress that belied the strange power she possessed. According to the Journal of Thomas Wilcox, a cotton factor present that day whose account was discovered in 1923 during the cataloging of the Charleston Historical Society's archives, something unnatural passed through the crowd when the woman called Esther appeared, a chill despite the morning heat. The auctioneer himself, a man named Bartholomew Preston, whose records of sales spanning 30 years provide a grim accounting of human commerce, appeared reluctant to touch her papers, handling the documents with visible discomfort. Blackwood, either oblivious to or undeterred by the peculiar atmosphere, approached the block after his successful bid, where Preston reportedly whispered something in his ear, words that caused a momentary hesitation in Blackwood's otherwise confident stride. The transaction was completed with unusual haste. The bill of sale, preserved in county records and notable for its brevity compared to Preston's typically meticulous documentation, listed only her name, approximate age of 24 years, and the unusually low purchase price. As Blackwood led his new acquisition through Charleston's cobblestone streets toward the harbor where his waiting boat would carry them to Magnolia Plantation, several witnesses noted in subsequent accounts that strangers crossed to the opposite side of the street as they passed, and a Gullah woman selling sweetgrass baskets made a protective sign with her fingers before hurriedly gathering her wares and disappearing down an alley. The journey from Charleston to Magnolia Plantation took the better part of a day, according to the ship's log of the riverboat Calliope, which carried Blackwood and his new acquisition upriver through marshy lowlands, where egrets stalked among cypress knees and alligators slumbered on muddy banks. Magnolia came into view as the afternoon light softened, its white columns rising like sentinels against a backdrop of ancient live oaks draped in Spanish moss, their gnarled branches creating patterns of shadow and light across the manicured lawn that surrounded the main house. Plantation records, meticulously maintained in leather-bound ledgers discovered during a 1934 historical survey of antebellum estates, revealed Blackwood as a man of precise habits and exacting standards, managing his 63 enslaved workers with what neighboring planters described as stern fairness, rather than the capricious cruelty common to the era. The household account books documented the rapid decline of domestic order following the death of his wife Caroline, who succumbed to childbed fever 6 months prior, leaving behind not only her grieving husband but 3 children, Martha, age 12, Thomas, age 9, and little Eleanor, just 6 years old, under the primary care of Mrs. Agnes Pemberton, an elderly housekeeper whose family had served the Blackwoods for 2 generations. The children's governess, Miss Harriet Thornwell, whose private correspondence with her sister in Philadelphia would later provide crucial insights into the events that followed, noted her immediate unease upon Esther's arrival, writing that the new house servant displays an education and refinement wholly inconsistent with her station, speaking not only in cultured tones but displaying knowledge of literature and even mathematics that has caused considerable consternation among the household staff. This disquiet escalated when Sarah, a kitchen maid who had been with the family since Martha's birth, reported to Mrs. Pemberton that Esther had correctly identified which bedroom belonged to which child without being told, and had inquired about the late Mrs. Blackwood's favorite roses, though no one had mentioned Caroline's passion for horticulture. Most disturbing was Mrs. Pemberton's discovery, recorded in her personal diary and found tucked behind a loose brick in the kitchen chimney in 1903, of Esther standing motionless in the nursery well past midnight, staring intently at the children's portraits arranged on the wall. Her expression, as the housekeeper would later describe to the parish priest, unnervingly familiar, as though she were gazing upon her own blood. Colonel Samuel Hartwood's shadow loomed over Esther's presence at Magnolia, through county courthouse records and local newspaper archives that painted a portrait of a man whose final months were shrouded in peculiarity. Dread. The Charleston Courier's obituary, published on the 12th of February 1858, described Hartwood as a distinguished veteran of the Seminole campaigns and a planter of considerable means, whose death at 57 had come unexpectedly during the night while alone in his study. Probate documents, filed with unusual haste according to the clerk's notation in the county register, revealed that Willowbrook Plantation, Hartwood's estate in neighboring Berkeley County, had been liquidated within weeks of his passing by distant cousins from Virginia who, according to multiple accounts in the personal diaries of Charleston Society members, refused to spend a single night in the main house. The hasty sale fueled rumors of financial collapse that permeated Charleston's drawing rooms. However, tax assessments and harvest records discovered in 1892 during the reorganization of county archives demonstrated that Willowbrook had, in fact, produced exceptional cotton yields for 3 consecutive seasons prior to Hartwood's death, with substantial sums deposited in the Planters and Mechanics Bank of Charleston. Business correspondence preserved in the Blackwood family papers established that Jeremiah and the Colonel had maintained cordial relations through occasional transactions at the cotton exchange, though acquaintances noted they were never observed in social settings together, a curious detail given their similar standing in society. Most significant was the sealed letter discovered in 1932 by Dr. Eleanor Montgomery, a historian researching antebellum Charleston, among uncatalogued materials in the State Archive. The letter, addressed to Blackwood in Hartwood's distinctive hand and dated precisely 1 week before his death, was marked for express delivery but bore no postal stamps, suggesting it had never been dispatched. Its contents, preserved now on microfilm at the University of South Carolina, contained pleasantries about crop prices and weather before abruptly shifting to an urgent, cryptically worded warning. I must caution you regarding certain unnatural occurrences that have manifested since the arrival of the woman Esther. Should circumstances ever place her in your proximity, remember that appearances deceive, and what seems a fortuitous acquisition may herald unspeakable consequences. Some things from the dark continent were never meant to cross the water. The first month of Esther's residence at Magnolia unfolded through the careful penmanship of young Martha Blackwood, whose leather-bound journal, discovered in 1945 when workers renovating the estate's east wing found it concealed within a hollow section of wainscoting, chronicled a progression of increasingly disquieting events. Father has placed the new woman in mother's position as head of household affairs, Martha wrote on April 30th, but something is not right. For this morning my silver hairbrush was upon my dressing table when I distinctly remember placing it in the drawer last evening. Subsequent entries detailed the children's mounting unease as objects throughout the house. Books, candlesticks, family daguerreotypes were found displaced by morning, always in arrangements that Martha described as deliberate, as though conveying some message we cannot comprehend. More disturbing were her accounts of strange singing and unknown words emanating from the slave quarters after midnight, coinciding with what plantation overseer Jackson Timberlake's records termed unusual restlessness among the field hands, who appeared exhausted during morning roll call. Most unsettling were Martha's observations of Esther herself, who displayed knowledge of the household that seemed impossible for a newcomer, directing visitors to rooms she had never been shown, referencing conversations that had occurred before her arrival, and once, according to an entry dated May 15th, accurately describing to Eleanor a dream the child had not shared with anyone. Martha noted her father's growing agitation, documenting his abrupt mood shifts and tendency to stare at Esther with an expression caught between fascination and fear. Though he dismissed the children's concerns as overwrought imagination brought on by grief, the journal's final pages recorded testimony from Sarah, the kitchen maid, who had suffered a severe burn from spilled cooking oil, only to have Esther apply a poultice of herbs gathered by moonlight that healed the wound completely by morning, a concoction whose ingredients Esther refused to disclose, saying only that such knowledge is passed through blood, not words, a statement that caused Mrs. Pemberton to cross herself and avoid Esther's gaze thereafter. The discovery that shattered Blackwood's understanding of his marriage and the woman he had purchased occurred on a rain-lashed evening in early June, when thunder rattled the windows of Magnolia's study as he searched his late wife's rosewood writing desk for financial documents needed for the quarterly tax assessment. According to his personal diary, a leather-bound volume discovered in 1967 by archivists cataloging recent acquisitions at the Charleston Historical Society, the bottom drawer had always remained locked, its tiny brass key kept on Caroline's person even in death, necessitating that he force it open with a letter opener that bent under his desperate pressure. Within lay a bundle of correspondence tied with blue ribbon, the topmost letter bearing the unmistakable seal of Willowbrook Plantation. I have today discovered something that has rendered the foundations of my existence unstable. Blackwood wrote in handwriting that grew increasingly unsteady as the entry continued. Letters spanning 5 years between my Caroline and Cole Hartwood, beginning with formal pleasantries regarding a botanical exchange, but evolving into expressions I cannot bear to transcribe here. The diary detailed his reading through the night, tracking the correspondence as it transformed from discussions of rare flower specimens to encoded messages of increasing intimacy and distress. Most disturbing was the final letter, dated merely 2 weeks before Caroline's death, in which she implored Hartwood to honor his sacred promise that you must never reveal what we both know about the woman called Esther, for such knowledge would destroy not only my husband's regard for me but place my children in circumstances I cannot contemplate without the deepest dread. Subsequent diary entries revealed Blackwood's psychological unraveling as he observed Esther with new awareness, noting similarities in her profile to Caroline's that he had previously overlooked, and a particular expression when addressing the children that awakens the most terrible suspicion. His writings became increasingly fragmented, pages filled with questions without answers, biblical references to sins of the father, and repeated phrases about blood recognizing blood. On June 17th, he wrote simply, "I must know the truth, though I fear knowledge will prove more devastating than ignorance. Tomorrow I shall confront her with the letters and demand what connection exists between my wife, Hartwood, and this woman who has brought disquiet to my household." While Magnolia's main house harbored its own growing disquiet, a more profound unease spread through the slave quarters, documented decades later through oral histories collected in the 1,930 seconds by researchers from the Federal Writers Project who interviewed elderly former slaves across South Carolina. These testimonies, preserved in typescript at the Library of Congress and largely overlooked until a 1978 dissertation on antebellum folk beliefs brought them to scholarly attention, revealed that Esther's arrival had sent immediate ripples of recognition and fear through the enslaved community. "That woman wasn't like the rest of us," recalled Josephine Baker, who had been 16 when Esther came to Magnolia. "She walked different, like the ground beneath her feet wasn't quite solid. And she spoke not just the master's English but French words and African words and sometimes sounds that weren't no language at all." Multiple accounts referenced Isaiah, who at 97 was the plantation's eldest resident, having been brought directly from the Guinea coast as a child before the official end of the slave trade. According to these narratives, Isaiah had taken one look at Esther and retreated to his cabin, refusing to emerge for 3 days, finally telling the others to keep distance between yourselves and that woman, for my grandmother told stories of women with the old power, who could speak to the spirits and bend the natural world to their will. Several testimonies mentioned livestock found dead without explanation, chickens with necks unbroken but hearts stilled, a calf discovered bloodless yet without wounds, incidents that coincided with Esther's excursions to gather herbs along the property's boundaries. Most disturbing were accounts of Esther disappearing into the cypress swamps that bordered the plantation's eastern edge, where several witnesses claimed to have observed, from a fearful distance, gatherings of figures moving in circular patterns around small fires, their chanting carrying across the water in what one described as words that made the air itself feel heavy. Like before a terrible storm, the overseer's log from this period, with its precise accounting of daily activities, contained unusual gaps during full moons, as though certain occurrences defied his ability or willingness to document them. While several entries noted the inexplicable failure of watchdogs to bark on nights when unfamiliar footprints were later discovered leading from the slave quarters toward the swamps and back again before dawn. As summer heat gave way to autumn chill, a mysterious illness descended upon Magnolia Plantation, its progression meticulously documented in the medical records of Dr. James Thornwell, whose papers were preserved in the Medical College of South Carolina archives following his death in 1862. The doctor's initial visit on September 29th noted symptoms of high fever, strange rashes in circular patterns, and periods of delirium affecting 3 house servants and, most alarmingly, Eleanor, Blackwood's youngest child. According to Thornwell's case notes, conventional treatments, bloodletting, mercury compounds, and quinine not only failed to alleviate symptoms but seemed to exacerbate them, with Eleanor's fever climbing dangerously on the 3rd night, as she called out repeatedly for her deceased mother in a voice the governess described as not entirely her own. Blackwood's desperate state was evident in the doctor's observation that the father appears haggard with worry, his own health clearly compromised by sleepless vigilance at his daughter's bedside. The turning point came when Esther approached Blackwood after Thornwell had departed, offering to prepare a remedy she claimed would cure the child. The doctor's return the following morning found Eleanor sitting upright in bed, fever broken, the mysterious rash faded to barely visible pale circles. Thornwell's private notes, discovered in a separate journal, kept hidden within his medical bag and recovered during the restoration of his former residence in 1912, expressed profound disquiet. The concoction administered to the child contained substances unfamiliar to medical science, with an odor unlike any medicinal compound known to me, earthy, yet with undertones reminiscent of certain tropical flora I encountered during my studies in the Caribbean. The journal revealed that Thornwell had secretly obtained samples of the remedy for analysis, writing to a colleague at Harvard Medical School who specialized in unusual compounds. However, no response was ever recorded in his papers, and subsequent entries showed increasing agitation regarding disturbing changes in the Blackwood household. His final visit to Magnolia, documented in his appointment book on October 17th, contained only the cryptic notation, "God help them all," followed by a pressed flower of a species not native to North America. Driven by mounting suspicion, Blackwood journeyed to the Berkeley County Courthouse in late October. His investigation into Colonel Hartwood's death documented in travel receipts found among his expense ledgers and in a series of increasingly urgent letters to contacts in Charleston legal circles. Court records, examined by Blackwood according to the clerk's visitor log, listed the official cause of death as apoplexy, yet rumors of more disturbing circumstances persisted through the county, recorded in parish gossip and the marginalia of community prayer lists. Most significant was a sworn statement by Elijah Morris, Willowbrook's groundskeeper, discovered in sheriff's records from February 1858 during a 1921 courthouse renovation. Morris testified to finding his master's body in the study at dawn, not merely dead but positioned in the center of what he described as a perfect circle drawn in ash, with strange markings like no writing I have ever seen extending outward like the spokes of a wheel. This detail, along with several pages of subsequent testimony, had been crossed out with heavy black ink, yet remained legible to careful examination. Even more disturbing was Morris's description of Hartwood's final expression, stricken from official documents but preserved in private correspondence between Sheriff Williams and Judge Holcomb. The colonel's eyes and mouth were open wide, his hands raised as if to ward off some attack, his countenance frozen in such terror as I have never witnessed on a human face, and would not wish to see again in my natural life. Blackwood's investigation culminated in a visit to the offices of Ingram and Sons, slave traders whose meticulous transaction records, preserved now in university archives as documentation of the domestic slave trade's brutal commerce, revealed that Hartwood had indeed purchased Esther, but not, as was customary, from another plantation. Instead, she had been acquired directly from the captain of the Fortunate Son, a vessel officially registered for cargo transport between Charleston and Havana, but suspected by port authorities of continuing illegal human trafficking decades after the Atlantic slave trade had been outlawed. The ship's manifest, which Blackwood obtained through considerable expense according to his account books, listed its final port before Charleston not as a Caribbean harbor but a coastal trading post in Dahomey, suggesting that Esther had been brought directly from West Africa, a rarity by the 1,850 seconds that raised profound questions about her true origins and the circumstances of her arrival in America. As winter descended upon Magnolia, the children's behavior grew increasingly disturbing, their transformation meticulously documented in the leather-bound diary of Harriet Thornwell, their governess, discovered in 1980 among a collection of personal papers donated to the University of South Carolina by the Thornwell family descendants. "The children speak of visitors I cannot see," wrote Miss Thornwell on November 12th, describing how little Eleanor would wake before dawn, claiming that Esther's friends had been sitting at the foot of her bed, telling stories about the old country across the water where the trees have spirits and the rivers speak in riddles. Thomas, the middle child, developed what the governess described as an unwholesome attachment to Esther, disappearing for hours only to be found in her quarters, returning with his mind filled with tales she claims are from the time before time, of great kingdoms and powerful queens who could command the elements with a whisper. Most alarming were the entries from late November, when Miss Thornwell recorded instances of all three children speaking words and phrases she could not comprehend, a phenomenon first dismissed as childish invention until she observed their facility with these utterances increasing daily. "They converse among themselves in this strange tongue during play," she noted on December 2nd, falling silent when I enter the room, their expressions suggesting complicity in some secret knowledge from which I am purposefully excluded. The diary reveals Miss Thornwell's growing terror as she recognized that the children were changing in ways beyond normal development, Martha's drawings filled with symbols matching those in Esther's private devotions, Thomas exhibiting knowledge of navigation by stars he had never been taught, and Eleanor singing lullabies in what the governess described as sounds that chill the blood, yet seem to summon dreams of distant shores. A notation at the bottom of the final page, added in trembling handwriting, indicated that Miss Thornwell had consulted privately with the parish priest, who suggested the children might be under an influence contrary to Christian teaching. This suspicion gained scholarly validation nearly a century later, when linguists examining phonetic transcriptions the governess had attempted of the children's speech identified elements consistent with ancient Dahomean dialects, languages the Blackwood children could not possibly have encountered through any conventional means of the period. The first heavy frost of December coincided with Blackwood's journey to Charleston, his departure recorded in the Plantation ledger alongside instructions for household management during his 3-day absence. Courthouse records, discovered during a 1923 cataloging of antebellum legal archives, confirmed his meetings with Witherford and Sons, a firm specializing in property law and contractual disputes, though the precise nature of their consultations remains unknown, as attorney-client documents from this period were lost in a courthouse fire during the Civil War. What survived were Blackwood's expense accounts, showing payment for 3 separate consultations and a substantial fee to a maritime lawyer with expertise in West African trade regulations. According to Mrs. Pemberton's household records, life at Magnolia continued in ordered routine during the master's absence, with Esther reassigned from her usual duties to assist in the kitchen, ostensibly to prepare for the Christmas feast, but understood by the staff as a means of keeping her under constant observation. Blackwood's return on December 10th, documented in his increasingly erratic diary entries, culminated in the horrifying discovery that the bundle of correspondence between his late wife and Colonel Hartwood, locked in his private desk drawer before his departure, had vanished completely, leaving behind only the blue ribbon that had bound them. His immediate interrogation of the household staff yielded no explanation, with multiple witnesses insisting that his study had remained locked throughout his absence, the key hanging in its usual place in the butler's pantry. Most perplexing was the statement given by Celia, the head cook, recorded by a Northern journalist in 1865 during his documentation of plantation life immediately following emancipation. That woman Esther spent every moment within my sight, working beside me from sunrise to well past sundown, never once leaving the kitchen except to sleep, singing strange songs under her breath while chopping herbs so fine they turned to powder. The diary's final entry regarding the missing letters expressed Blackwood's increasing psychological distress. The evidence I required has been spirited away as though it never existed, yet I know what I read, and more significantly, I know what I see now in the faces of my children, echoes of features I once observed in another countenance entirely, looking out at me from eyes that hold secrets older than this troubled land. The winter solstice of the 21st of December, 1858, marked a night of profound disturbance at Magnolia Plantation, documented decades later through testimonies collected from former slaves during Reconstruction by Northern missionaries whose records were preserved in the American Antiquarian Society archives. These accounts described unusual activities in the cypress swamp beyond the eastern cotton fields, with multiple witnesses reporting lights that moved like fireflies but larger, in patterns that seemed to be writing words in the air. Blackwood's personal journal, its pages growing increasingly erratic in both penmanship and content, recorded his fateful decision after observing Esther slipping from her quarters shortly after midnight, her silhouette briefly illuminated by moonlight as she moved with unusual purpose toward the property boundary. "I resolved to follow at a distance," he wrote, "driven by suspicions that have robbed me of sleep these many weeks." His account, written the following dawn in handwriting that lurched across the page, detailed trailing her through frost-covered fields into the densest part of the swamp, where he discovered a clearing he had never known existed despite owning the property for 15 years. There, Esther was met by no fewer than a dozen others, some recognized as belonging to neighboring plantations, standing in a perfect circle around a fire that burned with flames of unusual hue. What followed, according to Blackwood's increasingly disjointed narrative, was a ritual involving synchronized movements that defied the natural limitations of the human form. Chants in a language that seemed to alter the very quality of the air around them, and what he described as transformations I cannot accept as real, though my eyes witnessed them in full clarity, features shifting, limbs elongating, shadows extending beyond what moonlight should permit. The journal records his horror when Esther, seemingly sensing his presence, turned directly toward his hiding place behind a cypress trunk, her eyes reflecting the strange fire not as points of light but as windows opening onto some impossible elsewhere. Blackwood confessed to fleeing in terror back to the main house, barricading himself in his study until dawn, when he emerged to find Esther preparing breakfast in the kitchen, showing no sign of nocturnal exertion, regarding me with eyes that held both knowledge and challenge. The revelation that would illuminate the horrifying truth behind Magnolia's unfolding nightmare came not from Blackwood's investigations but from a discovery made 54 years after the events, when Reverend Thomas Whitfield's family Bible was donated to the Charleston Historical Society in 1912 and found to contain a letter secreted within its leather binding. The missive, written in Colonel Hartwood's hand and addressed to Blackwood but evidently never delivered, bore a final confession penned days before the colonel's death. "I can no longer bear the weight of my transgressions alone, and so commit to paper the truth I have concealed these many years, that the woman called Esther is not merely my property but my natural daughter. born of a union with an extraordinary woman acquired during my military service in Florida, who claimed descent from a royal line of spiritual practitioners in Dahomey. The letter detailed how this woman, named Adayez, had demonstrated abilities that defied rational explanation, and had died shortly after childbirth, but not before prophesying that her daughter would inherit powers that would grow beyond containment. Most disturbing was Hartwood's revelation regarding Blackwood's late wife. Caroline came into my care as an infant when her mother, a young woman of good family with whom I had formed an attachment before my marriage, died of childbed fever. I arranged her adoption by the Winslow family without revealing my paternity, watching from a distance as she grew into a woman of grace and beauty who, by cruel twist of fate, married a man I counted among my acquaintances. This bombshell gained scientific credibility in 1973 when genealogist Margaret Hayward, researching antebellum family structures, uncovered baptismal and property records confirming both Caroline's adoption and Hartwood's financial contributions to her upbringing, establishing beyond reasonable doubt that Esther and Caroline were half-sisters, meaning that Blackwood's children shared blood with the woman who now presided over their household. Hartwood's final confession explained the mysterious connection between the women. The spiritual gift flows stronger through each generation of daughters born to my bloodline, manifesting in Caroline as unusual intuition and prophetic dreams. She confided to me in her letters, but emerging in Esther with a potency that increasingly terrifies me. For she has learned to channel abilities her mother only dimly understood, and I fear what may awaken in Caroline's children should Esther ever encounter them. The transformation of Magnolia from model plantation to site of growing dread unfolded through county records and the alarmed correspondence of neighboring planters during the early months of 1859. Tax documents filed in February revealed Blackwood had dismissed his overseer without replacement, while agricultural schedules showed a precipitous decline in production as field work grew increasingly irregular. William Carrington, whose plantation bordered Magnolia's western edge, wrote to his brother in Virginia describing how Blackwood appears to have abandoned all pretense of conventional management, allowing his people unusual freedoms, including unsupervised gatherings after dark, the consequences of which can be heard echoing across the property line. Rhythmic sounds and voices raised in unfamiliar harmonies that cause our own workers to grow agitated. Visitors to the estate, once welcomed regularly for social occasions, reported dramatic changes to the once immaculate property, with the gardens allowed to grow wild and the main house falling into uncharacteristic disrepair. Most disturbing were accounts from the few callers still received, who described Blackwood's obsessive focus on peculiar modifications to the structure, symbols resembling those in ancient Egyptian papyri carved into door frames, strange concoctions buried at precise intervals around the foundation, and unusual herbs planted in geometric patterns visible from upper windows. The Charleston Mercury made oblique reference to disturbing rumors regarding the Blackwood estate in its society pages, though details were notably absent. Most alarming were the observations recorded in Reverend James Holcomb's private journal, discovered during a 1937 church renovation, detailing the children's transformation. Young Thomas Blackwood interrupted today's sermon on Exodus with questions regarding ancient deities that no Christian child should comprehend, while little Eleanor spoke words during prayer that caused Mrs. Witherford to faint dead away. The journal's final mention of the family, dated February 26th, documented their exclusion from the church. The Blackwood family's presence has been deemed disruptive to proper worship, following Eleanor's utterance of what witnesses described as blasphemies and prophecies delivered in a voice unlike her own, causing several parishioners to flee the sanctuary in terror. The mysterious culmination of Magnolia's transformation occurred in the second week of March 1859, when, according to Berkeley County Sheriff's records discovered during a courthouse reorganization in 1901, Jacob Thornton, owner of the neighboring Willow Creek Plantation, reported an unnatural silence prevailing over the Blackwood property. No smoke rises from the chimneys, no workers visible in the fields, and no response to repeated calls at the main house. Thornton's statement read, prompting Sheriff William Denton to assemble a party of deputies to investigate on March 12th. The official report, filed the following day and published in abbreviated form in the Charleston Courier, documented a scene that defied rational explanation. The plantation stood completely deserted, absent of all human presence, yet bearing no signs of violence, theft, or hasty departure. Deputy James Harrison's sworn testimony described entering the main house to find a breakfast table set for 4, with food partially consumed, teacups still containing liquid, yet no sign of disturbance, as though the family had simply vanished between sips of tea. Subsequent search revealed that every structure on the property, the main house, slave quarters, barns, and outbuildings, had been similarly abandoned, with personal possessions, clothing, and valuables left behind intact. Most perplexing was the discovery that no horses or wagons were missing, leaving investigators unable to determine how 67 individuals could have departed without transportation or been removed against their will without signs of struggle. The only potential explanation came from Blackwood's journal, found open on his study desk. Its final entry dated March 11th and written in what handwriting experts would later describe as remarkably steady compared to previous pages, suggesting a mind that had found unexpected clarity. The entry read simply, "We go willingly to her homeland. The children are hers now, as perhaps they always were. The blood calls to blood, and we answer." County records documented an exhaustive search of surrounding forests, swamps, and waterways that yielded no trace of the missing population. Charleston newspapers reported the disappearance for several weeks before public interest waned, with the final article noting that the Blackwood mystery joins the annals of inexplicable occurrences that occasionally befall even the most established families. The property remained untouched for years, avoided by locals who claimed to hear voices speaking unknown languages when passing after dusk. The most unsettling chapter in the Blackwood mystery unfolded in our own time, when archaeological excavations at the former Magnolia Plantation site in 2018, conducted as part of an environmental impact assessment before commercial development, uncovered a sealed chamber beneath what had been the Professity and Factus main house's foundation. Carbon dating of the mortar and analysis of construction techniques placed its creation precisely during the final months of Blackwood's ownership, while ground-penetrating radar revealed that the chamber had been intentionally concealed through sophisticated engineering that archaeologists termed inconsistent with known antebellum building practices. The artifacts recovered from this subterranean space defied conventional historical narratives. Clay vessels inscribed with symbols that specialists from the Smithsonian identified as belonging to Royal Dahomean spiritual traditions, botanical specimens preserved through unknown methods, containing plant species native to West Africa but unknown in North America, ritual implements crafted from materials not indigenous to the continent, and most significantly, a daguerreotype in remarkable preservation showing Jeremiah Blackwood, his 3 children, and Esther, arranged as a formal family portrait, all wearing identical amulets of unusual design around their necks. Most disturbing was the leather-bound journal sealed within a copper box, its pages written in what linguistic experts confirmed was Blackwood's handwriting, but composed in a language combining English syntax with ancient Dahomean dialectical elements that defied complete translation. The partially deciphered final entry, dated March 10th, 1859 to 1 day before the disappearance, suggested not an ending, but a transformation. We are becoming what Esther always was. Not death, but rebirth awaits us across the water. The children's eyes have already changed, seeing now beyond the veil that separates worlds. Tomorrow, at the convergence of moon and tide, we shed these temporary forms. The excavation director's final report, submitted to the South Carolina Historical Commission but classified as restricted access in 2019, following unexplained incidents among research team members, included the unsettling revelation that amulets identical to those in the Blackwood daguerreotype have been discovered at 7 archaeological sites across the American South, each connected to inexplicable disappearances spanning more than 2 centuries, suggesting that the events at Magnolia were neither the beginning nor the end of a lineage whose blood continues to answer calls from beyond known shores.